Warhammer 40K has a timeline spanning over 60 million years, and almost none of it makes sense on the first read. Contradictory sources, silent retcons, and lore that shifts between editions have left even veteran fans confused about what actually happened. So today I'm breaking down every major confusing event in the franchise and explaining what we actually know, starting with the one conflict that broke reality itself. The War in Heaven, roughly 60 million years before the 41st millennium. A species called the Necrontyr were dying, not metaphorically. Their homestar bathed them in radiation so intense that their entire civilization lived short, cancer-riddled lives. They were brilliant, furious, and desperate. So when they encountered the Old Ones, an ancient race of immortal psychic beings who refused to share the secret of eternal life, the Necrontyr did what any reasonable civilization would do. They declared war on gods. Problem was, they lost, badly. The Old Ones were too powerful, too entrenched, too connected to the warp. So the Necrontyr turned to something worse, the Citan, star gods, beings that literally fed on stars. The Necrontyr offered their own flesh, their entire species, in exchange for the power to win. Every single Necrontyr was transferred into a metal body, stripped of emotion, identity, and free will. They became the Necrons, and with the Citan leading them, they finally started winning. But here's where it gets dark for everyone else. The Old Ones didn't just fight back with their own power. They engineered entire species as living weapons. The Eldar, the Krork, which are basically proto-orcs. This is why so many major factions in 40K exist at all. They were biological ammunition. The war was so catastrophic that it tore the barrier between real space and the warp wide open. That damage never healed. Every demon, every chaos god, every warp storm terrorizing the galaxy in the 41st millennium traces back to this single prehistoric conflict. One war, 60 million years ago, broke reality permanently. And the kicker, after winning, the Necrons turned on the Citan and shattered them. How exactly they managed to destroy beings described as eating stars is genuinely underexplained in the lore. The mechanism changes depending on which Codex edition you're reading. What we do know is the Necrons won, then sealed themselves in tomb worlds across the galaxy to sleep for millions of years. So to recap, a dying species sold their souls, broke the universe, created the conditions for every future horror in the setting, and then took a nap. And almost nobody in the 41st millennium even knows this happened. But the War in Heaven was only the beginning, because what grew in that broken warp would eventually consume an entire species. The fall of the Eldar. The most advanced civilization in galactic history didn't get destroyed by an enemy fleet. They didn't lose a war. They partied so hard they accidentally created a god that ate them. I'm serious. The Eldar Empire at its peak was incomprehensibly powerful. They'd mastered the warp, conquered the galaxy, and had technology that made even the Old Ones' creations look primitive. They had literally nothing left to struggle against, so they got bored. And when an immortal psychic species with mastery over reality itself gets bored, things go very wrong very fast. Over thousands of years, the Eldar descended into pure excess. Every sensation pushed further, every pleasure amplified, every dark impulse indulged without consequence. Here's the thing, there were consequences. They just couldn't see them yet. Because deep inside the warp, all of that collective psychic hedonism was pooling together, slowly forming something conscious, something hungry. A new chaos god was taking shape, sculpted entirely from Eldar emotion, and nobody noticed until it was far too late. When Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, finally woke up, the psychic shockwave killed the majority of the Eldar species instantly, not in a war, not over decades. In a single catastrophic moment, their souls were devoured, their afterlives were consumed, and the birth scream of Slaanesh ripped a permanent hole between real space and the warp that still exists today. That hole is the Eye of Terror, one of the most important locations in all of 40K, and it exists because an entire civilization couldn't stop chasing the next high. Now here's where it gets complicated. The exact timeline of the fall is genuinely contradictory across official sources. Older codices place it around the boundary of M29 and M30, but certain Black Library novels describe it as a slow degradation over centuries rather than one cataclysmic moment. Was it an event or a process? The lore never fully commits to one answer, and there's an even darker question the community still debates. Did the Eldar know what they were creating? Some sources say prophets warned them and were completely ignored. Others suggest the descent was so gradual that no single generation could perceive the danger. It's never definitively resolved. What is clear is how the survivors split. The Craftworld Eldar escaped early on massive world ships. The Exodites had already colonized distant planets, and the Dark Eldar survived by hiding in the pocket dimension of Kamarag, sustaining themselves by stealing the souls of others. 3 factions, 3 survival strategies, 3 completely different cultures, all born from the same apocalypse. But if you think accidentally creating one chaos god is bad, now wait until you hear what happened when humanity's greatest champion decided to fight all 4 4 of them at once. The Horus Heresy. This is the one everyone thinks they know. The Emperor's favorite son, Horus Lupercal, War Master of all Space Marine legions, gets wounded by a chaos-tainted blade on the moon of Davin, falls to corruption, and drags half the Imperium into the most devastating civil war in human history. 9 Primarchs turn traitor. 9 stay loyal. Brother fights brother across 1,000 worlds, and it all ends with Horus dead and the Emperor entombed on the Golden Throne for the next 10,000 years. Simple, right? Here's the thing. Almost nothing about the Horus Heresy is as clean as that summary makes it sound. Let's start with the real-world problem. The heresy spans over 60 Black Library novels written by dozens of different authors across nearly 2 decades. That is an insane amount of material, and when you have that many writers interpreting the same characters and events, you get contradictions, not small ones. Fundamental disagreements about why entire legions fell to chaos. Lorgar turned traitor because the Emperor publicly humiliated him for worshipping him as a god, crushing his entire belief system. That's a coherent, almost sympathetic motivation. But then you have Magnus the Red, who made a catastrophic deal with Tzeentch thinking he was saving the Imperium, and accidentally gave chaos the opening it needed to accelerate everything. Was Magnus a traitor or a victim? Fans have been arguing about this for years, and the novels genuinely support both readings depending on which book you pick up, and that's just 2 of the 9. Every single traitor Primarch has a different reason for falling, and the community cannot agree on which ones were genuinely corrupted versus which ones had legitimate grievances that the Emperor's own failures created. But here's where it gets genuinely paranoid. Inside the 40K universe, the Imperium has deliberately suppressed, mythologized, or outright fabricated its own history of the heresy. Characters living in the 41st millennium have a version of these events that players reading the novels know is wrong. The Imperium's entire culture, its religious fanaticism, its hatred of the alien and the mutant, all of it is built on a catastrophically distorted memory of its own founding trauma. So you're dealing with unreliable narration on 2 levels: the in-universe propaganda and the real-world publishing inconsistencies. And speaking of real-world inconsistencies, the original Rogue Trader era lore from the late 1980s described the heresy in broad strokes that the 2006 novel series contradicted wholesale. Games Workshop has never formally deprecated those old accounts. They just quietly moved on. So technically, 2 competing versions of the heresy exist in print, and the community has collectively decided which one counts. Nobody can fully agree on what happened during the heresy. Not the characters, not the authors, not even the publisher. And somehow, it only gets murkier from here. The death of Sanguinius. Everything we've talked about so far has been massive. Galaxy-spanning betrayals, legions clashing across entire star systems, the gods playing chess with civilizations. But the Horus Heresy ultimately comes down to one moment, one body on a floor. Sanguinius, the angel, Primarch of the Blood Angels, wings, golden armor, a face that literally inspired worship wherever he walked. He was, by almost every account, the noblest of the Emperor's sons, and he's the only loyalist Primarch confirmed to have died during the entire heresy. Here's what we know for certain. Sanguinius boarded Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, during the Siege of Terra. He confronted Horus directly, and when the Emperor finally arrived to face his fallen son, he found Sanguinius already dead. That's it. That's the confirmed canon for decades. The exact details of what happened in that room were left deliberately vague. Did Sanguinius fight Horus to a standstill? Did he land a single meaningful blow? Did he die instantly, swatted aside like nothing? Nobody knew. Games Workshop kept it shrouded in myth, told through conflicting accounts and Blood Angels legends that might be grief-stained propaganda as much as history. The Siege of Terra novel series started filling in gaps, and The Buried Dagger gave us more context than we'd ever had. But here's where the community splits wide open. Some fans take these novels as definitive canon. Others argue they're written as in-universe retellings, filtered through thousands of years of Blood Angels mythology and mourning. The truth might be somewhere in between, and that ambiguity is entirely intentional. But the real question, the one that has haunted this fandom for years, is simple. Did his death matter? There's a long-standing theory that Sanguinius, in his final moments, managed to crack Horus's armor. Not metaphorically, literally. That his last blow created a flaw in the chaos-enhanced protection surrounding Horus, and that flaw is the only reason the Emperor's psychic attack was able to reach Horus's soul and destroy him. Some Black Library text supports this reading, none of it confirms it outright, and that ambiguity is devastating, because if it's true, Sanguinius didn't just die a hero. He's the reason the Emperor won. The entire Imperium exists because of one angel's final swing. If it's not true, he died for nothing, broken by a brother who had become something monstrous, and his sacrifice was symbolic at best. The Blood Angels believe it mattered. Their entire culture is built on that belief, and every single Blood Angel successor chapter carries the proof in their blood, literally. The Black Rage, a psychic curse that forces Marines to relive Sanguinius's final moments of terror and fury, is one of the only heresy-era consequences that's mechanically present on the tabletop in the 41st millennium. 10,000 years later, his sons are still dying his death. Whether his last stand saved the Imperium or not, the grief is real. And grief that old, baked into the genetic code of an entire legion, that changes things in ways even the Chaos Gods didn't predict. The Siege of Terra. Here's what makes the Siege of Terra so confusing. It's not the battle itself. Everyone knows how it ends. The Emperor kills Horus, the traitors flee, humanity survives. That part has been established lore for decades. The confusing part is that nobody can agree on how any of it actually happened. The broad strokes are simple enough. Traitor forces numbering in the billions descended on Earth and besieged the Imperial Palace for 55 days. It was the final apocalyptic battle of the Horus Heresy. Every loyalist force that could reach Terra threw themselves into the defense, and when it became clear that the walls would fall, the Emperor personally teleported aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, to end it face to face. But here's where it gets complicated. For decades, Games Workshop left the specific details of the siege deliberately unwritten. The outcome was known. The moment-to-moment reality was not. Old source books gave vague descriptions, rough casualty figures, and broad summaries. Then in 2018, Black Library started publishing the Siege of Terra novel series. And suddenly, history that had been ambiguous for 30 years was being written in real time. Fans are literally reading these books as they release and watching established lore get rewritten with every volume. Older source books describe the siege in ways the novels directly contradict. Casualty figures don't match. The roles of specific Space Marine chapters have been revised. Even the geography of the battle has changed, and Games Workshop has never issued formal errata saying which version is the real one. So you've got fans arguing over events that are simultaneously canon and not canon depending on which book you're holding. Then there's the single most debated decision in all of 40,000. Why did the Emperor leave the Golden Throne to fight Horus personally? Some sources say he had a psychic vision that this was the only path to victory. Others say he was forced by collapsing defenses and had no choice. And at least one interpretation suggests he knew he would die, or at least accepted that outcome before he ever teleported aboard. Nobody agrees. The lore supports all three readings, but the real tragedy isn't the battle, it's the aftermath. The Emperor defeated Horus but was mortally wounded in the process. His broken body was placed on the Golden Throne, a device he was only ever meant to occupy temporarily. That was 10,000 years ago. The throne is still running. It requires the sacrifice of 10,000 psychers every single day just to keep the Emperor's shattered form alive. And every source in the setting describes it as failing. Slowly, irreversibly failing. The Imperium won the Siege of Terra, and it has been dying from that victory ever since. The Emperor saved humanity by becoming a near corpse on life support, and 10 millennia of religious indoctrination means nobody in the setting can even recognize this as the tragedy it is. Which brings us to what happened when that slow decay finally reached a breaking point. The Age of Apostasy. 5,000 years after Horus broke the Imperium, a man with zero military genius and zero psychic power almost destroyed it even more thoroughly. His name was Goge Vandire, and his weapon was paperwork. Here's what happened. In the 36th millennium, Vandire held the title of High Lord of Terra as Master of the Administratum, which already made him one of the most powerful bureaucrats alive. But that wasn't enough. He managed to seize control of the ecclesiarchy as well, making him the simultaneous head of the Imperium's government and its state religion. Think about that for a second. One man controlling both the taxes and the faith of a million worlds. Outside of the Emperor himself, nobody in Imperial history had ever held that much consolidated power, and he used it exactly how you'd expect a power-mad zealot to use it. Vandire's reign became known as the Reign of Blood, and it earned that name. He purged rivals, crushed dissent, and turned the Imperium's own institutions into instruments of personal terror. But his most brilliant and most disturbing move was corrupting the brides of the Emperor, an all-female warrior order devoted entirely to the Emperor's service. Vandire convinced them he was divinely protected. The story goes that he had himself shot at point-blank range and survived, likely through some kind of conversion field technology, but the brides took it as a miracle. From that moment, they became his personal executioners, an entire order of elite warriors, fanatically loyal, answering only to him. His downfall is where it gets genuinely weird. A custodian named the Companions managed to bring Alicia Dominica, the leader of the brides, directly before the Golden Throne, into the Emperor's presence. What happened in that room, nobody knows. The canonical record simply says she entered, she saw the Emperor, and she emerged changed. She walked straight back to Vandire Vandar and cut his head off. That's it. That's the explanation. No details on what the Emperor said, how he communicated, or whether he communicated at all. The Emperor hasn't spoken coherently since the heresy by virtually every other account in the lore. The Golden Throne requires constant psychic maintenance just to keep him alive. So either this encounter was metaphorical, genuinely miraculous, or it's quiet evidence that the Emperor is far more aware and active than the Imperium believes. Games Workshop has never clarified which one, deliberately. But here's the kicker, and honestly, one of the funniest pieces of lore in the entire setting. After Vandar's death, the Imperium passed something called the Decree Passive. It's a law that forbids the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. The most powerful religious institution in human history, governing the faith of trillions, legally banned from having a male army. So what did they do? They took the reformed brides of the Emperor, restructured them into the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, and built one of the most elite military forces in the entire galaxy. All women, technically compliant with the law. That legal loophole is actual canon, and it's the reason the Sisters of Battle exist as an all-female faction to this day. The Imperium survived a tyrant and responded with the most grimdark piece of bureaucratic malicious compliance ever written. But if Vandir's reign proved that one man could hijack the entire Imperium from within, the next event proves that the greatest threat was always coming from outside, the 13th Black Crusade. For 10,000 years, Abaddon the Despoiler launched Black Crusade after Black Crusade out of the Eye of Terror. 12 times he came, 12 times he was pushed back, and the fanbase gave him a nickname that stuck, Failbaddon. The memes were everywhere. Forum posts, fan art, endless jokes about the most incompetent villain in science fiction. The guy had 10,000 years, the backing of 4 Chaos Gods, and an army of traitor Space Marines, and he couldn't take a single fortress world. He was a joke. But here's the thing, he wasn't failing. At least that's what Games Workshop eventually told us. The retcon went like this. Each of the 12 previous Black Crusades had actually achieved a hidden strategic objective. One destroyed a specific set of Necron pylons. Another retrieved a demon weapon. Another tested Imperial response times. Abaddon wasn't throwing himself at Cadia over and over like an idiot. He was executing a 10,000-year chess game, and nobody noticed because the Imperium kept declaring victory after each retreat. Some fans accepted this. Others called it exactly what it looked like. A post hoc justification written to rescue a character the lore had accidentally turned into a punchline. And whether you buy the retcon or reject it completely changes how you read everything that came next, because the 13th Black Crusade worked. In 999 M41, Abaddon launched the largest chaos invasion the galaxy had ever seen. Cadia, the fortress world that had guarded the Eye of Terror's primary exit point for 10 millennia, held its ground. The defensive lines didn't break, the soldiers didn't run. Cadia was winning, so Abaddon dropped a Blackstone fortress on it, a moon-sized ancient weapon hurled from orbit directly into the planet's surface. Cadia cracked, Cadia broke apart, Cadia died, but it did not surrender. That phrase became one of the most iconic lines in modern 40K, and it earned every bit of that reputation. Now here's where the confusion gets real. The 13th Black Crusade had been an ongoing narrative event for over a decade. The Eye of Terror campaign supplement dropped in 2003, and it implied very different outcomes than what the Gathering Storm books eventually delivered years later. Fans who had followed the story from the beginning found the resolution contradicted things they'd been told were canon. It was jarring, and the community still argues about it. But the consequences were undeniable. With Cadia gone, the Chaos God Tzeentch tore a permanent warp rift across the entire Milky Way. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a screaming wound in reality that literally split the galaxy in half. Let that sink in. Not a sector, not a system. The entire galaxy divided into 2 halves, with one side cut off from the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that makes faster than light travel possible. Every strategic assumption the Imperium had operated on for 10,000 years became instantly obsolete. This is the moment modern Warhammer 40K was born. Everything before it is the old setting. Everything after it is a universe where the galaxy is broken. Half of it is in perpetual darkness. And the villain everyone laughed at turned out to be the one who ended an era. Whether that's brilliant long-term storytelling or a desperate rescue job depends entirely on who you ask. But either way, what came next might be even more controversial. Guilliman's return. For roughly 10,000 years, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, Rubaut Guilliman, was essentially a corpse on display, frozen in a stasis field at the exact moment of his death, preserved in the Temple of Correction on Macraga, a wound from the traitor Primarch Fulgrim's poisoned blade stopped just short of killing him. Pilgrims came to see him. Entire generations of Ultramarines served and died, never knowing their gene father is anything other than a statue behind glass. And then, in 2017, Games Workshop actually brought him back. The Gathering Storm narrative did something the setting had never done before. It moved the clock forward, not in some ancient flashback, not in a Horus Heresy prequel novel, in the actual current timeline. A living Primarch walked the Imperium for the first time in 10 millennia, and nothing about the setting has been the same since. Here's how it happened and why it's so controversial. Guilliman's resurrection wasn't a human achievement. It required the Eldar, specifically Yvraine, leader of the Inari, channeling the power of Ennead, the partially awakened Eldar god of the dead, alongside the machinations of Segarach, the laughing god. Alien gods literally breathed life back into humanity's greatest general. Think about what that means inside a universe where the state religion teaches that all aliens are abominations. A Primarch, a demigod of the Emperor's own creation, owes his second life to Xenos sorcery. The theological chaos this caused within the Imperium's own institutions is still unresolved in the lore, but the resurrection itself isn't even the most interesting part. Guilliman woke up and immediately hated everything he saw. This is one of the most compelling character beats in modern 40K. The man who helped build the Imperium, who wrote the Codex Astartes, who believed in reason, secular governance, and the advancement of humanity, opened his eyes to a galaxy-spanning theocratic nightmare. Superstition had replaced science. Cruelty had replaced justice. The Emperor, his father, who explicitly rejected worship, was now seated at the center of the most oppressive religious institution imaginable. Guilliman looked at 10,000 years of human civilization and saw a failed state wearing his father's face. He was declared Lord Commander in Imperial Regent, the highest authority beneath the Emperor himself, and his first major act was unleashing the Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of enhanced Astartes that had been secretly developed by Archmagos Belisarius Cael over the full 10,000 years of Guilliman's absence. Cael claimed Guilliman himself had given the order before his near death, essentially meaning Guilliman anticipated the Imperium's decay and prepared a contingency spanning 10 millennia. And this is where the fan base splits clean in half. Veteran players look at the Primaris Marines and see a product line. Newer, bigger, more expensive models that needed an in-universe excuse to exist. The idea that Guilliman somehow foresaw 10,000 years of galactic history in pre-ordered and upgraded army feels to many like commercial logic dressed in lore clothing. The timeline doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Cael's 10,000-year secret project with zero leaks, zero interference, zero resource shortages, strains belief even by 40,000 standards. On the other side, newer fans and lore analysts point to Cael's established genius, the canonical text of the Gathering Storm and Dark Imperium novels, and the fact that Guilliman was always the Primarch most likely to plan ahead. The lore supports it if you accept the premise. The problem is that the premise itself feels reverse engineered from a sales catalog. Nobody's wrong, that's the tension. The Primaris are simultaneously a cynical retail decision and a lore development with real narrative weight, and the fan community will never fully agree on how to balance those two realities. But here's what makes Guilliman's return the perfect ending to this video. Every single confusing, contradictory, galaxy-breaking event we've covered, the Horus Heresy, the fall of Cadia, the Great Rift, all of it, produced the Imperium that Guilliman woke up to, and he finds it monstrous. The architect looked at the building and didn't recognize it. Worse, he recognized exactly how every failure, every compromise, every act of fanaticism stacked on top of each other to create something his father would despise. That's the real weight of Guilliman's return, not a Primarch swinging a sword again. A man realizing that everything he fought for became the very thing he fought against, and he has to fix it anyway. Every confusing event in this timeline is a brick in that wall. Now you know what built it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.